Okay, so today we're going to talk about federalism, which could be broadly defined as the division of power between a national or a federal government and a state or a local government. And this slide is going to give us an overview of everything that we'll talk about. We'll be talking about the powers that are granted to each of these entities, as well as the powers that are denied them. Powers that are granted to the national government are also called delegated powers, while powers that are state powers are called reserved powers, and we'll get into why they are called that a little bit later. There are also concurrent powers, which we'll talk about, which are powers that are shared by both a national and a state government. At a national level, there are three types of powers. Expressed, which means that they are expressed in the Constitution, that they are actually written there explicitly. Powers that are implied are powers that we can derive from the expressed powers, and then inherent powers are powers that we can assume would go to a national government just by their nature. For a state government, those powers are somewhat outlined in the 10th Amendment, which basically says that any powers that are not denied the state nor delegated to the national government can reside with the state governments. There are also powers, again, that are denied both. Well, denied each and then denied both. So we'll talk about a few of those as well. So first, let's talk about the national government. So once again, express powers are powers that are explicitly listed in the Constitution. And you can find them in Article 1, Section 18, giving a few powers. Let's give a few examples. To coin money, to regulate trade, to declare war, to grant patents. So all of these powers are powers that are actually listed in Article 1, Section 18. These are powers that are delegated to the national government, that they are expressed. Now, if we talk about implied, what can we imply from these specific powers? They might not be explicitly written, but once again, as it says in the slide, they can be reasonably suggested, but they are derived actually from those expressed powers. We call these powers that are necessary and proper. This gives our lawmakers a little bit of leeway to build upon the skeleton of the Constitution to interpret what they seem necessary and proper to be delegated to the national government. In the elastic clause, it allows the national government to do things like build dams, highways, roads, and then also to determine certain crimes. Now, if you look at these specific powers, they make sense. It makes sense that these responsibilities would be given to the national government, that a highway would be their responsibility because that highway usually goes in between states. Dams will affect multiple states, things like that. So as we're going through this PowerPoint, be thinking that the overall general rule could be that powers are given to the national government if those powers affect more than one state. And so that would be a broad way of thinking about it. Obviously, there's going to be certain more specifics as we go through, but that's a good way of thinking about it. A few inherent powers that we can talk about today. Once again, these are inherent. They're not written in the Constitution, nor are they implied, but they are. It would be reasonable to assume that these powers would go to a national government. Things like regulating immigration. Immigration affects the borders of the entire nation. It affects all the states of the nation. Diplomatic recognition to other nations, so any foreign affairs are going to be granted to a national government. Protecting the nation, things will be included, so the ability to raise an army, to create a draft, to declare war, all of those things will be allocated to a national government. Now, there are also powers that are denied a national government, and our framers did this in order to protect the people and also to protect the states. So some that are expressly denied, they cannot infringe upon the rights of speech or press. Remember that these are listed in the Bill of Rights, which was hugely important in ratifying the Constitution in the first place. Also, the national government can be denied certain rights if they are actually not delegated in the Constitution. So if there's silence in the Constitution about a certain power, it can be denied the national government. And then in the federal system, they cannot tax states. So that's a little bit more specific, protecting the states, once again, the balance of power between the two. So now let's talk about the state government. As I said earlier, in the 10th Amendment, it says that powers are reserved to the states that are not allocated specifically to the federal government and that are also not denied to the states. So kind of these in-between powers are typically allocated to the state government. We call those reserved powers. A few examples here are very specific, and a healthy way of thinking about this is to think the state is granted powers that affect, power to create laws and do things that affect people in their states. For example, granting the legal marriage age. Marriage laws in general, that's why there is such a debate over same-sex marriage right now, and that it changes from state to state. Drinking ages, other laws that have to do with substances. Professional licenses. As a teacher teaching in Utah, I cannot go to another state without actually fulfilling some of their requirements, without taking a test that shows I am competent to teach in their state. So that would be, and that has to do also with licenses to practice law and other things. They also have the power to confiscate property, to establish schools, and that's a really important power that states have to manage their own schools. All of these things being basically, states are given powers over their own citizens because it is assumed that they will know what's best for their citizens, specifically in these areas. Overall, you could think of it the way it's written here, that the state has the ability and the power and the responsibility to protect the public health, morals, safety, welfare of its own citizens. And Utah would know what's best for its own citizens more than the federal government. So kind of be thinking of it in those two terms. There are also powers that are denied the states, that not because the states are not given those powers explicitly because they are not the federal or national government. They cannot make treaties. That makes sense. Obviously, you're not going to make a treaty between the state of Arizona and the country of Great Britain because Great Britain is a country, and any treaty that is made between the U.S. will affect and Great Britain would affect the entire country. Printing money, we don't have multiple currencies. We have one currency, and that is used throughout the country. So going back to this, once again, kind of thinking about it in terms of these things are making treaties, printing money, all of these would affect multiple states. So they are actually denied, a state cannot take these powers and use them. Concurrent powers mean that both the state and the nation have these powers. They share them. And a few examples are collecting taxes. When you work for a company, you pay state taxes, you pay federal taxes. Defining certain crimes, you can be convicted at a state level and at a national level. And then condemning or taking private property for public use. All of these powers are powers that both the nation and the state share. There are also powers that are denied both of them. And the best way to think of this, it's pretty self-explanatory. Both governments cannot violate the rights of citizens, which is obviously very important in order to protect the public. So let's talk about the Supremacy Clause a little bit. The Supremacy Clause basically gives power, first and foremost, to the federal government. If there is a conflict between the lower law and the higher one wins. So at the lowest level, we have the city and county laws, the city of Murray, the county of Salt Lake. And then, of course, it goes to the state, so the Utah state laws and statutes. And then we have our state constitutions, followed by acts of Congress, red being here the states, blue being the federal government, the Congress, talking about the Congress, the federal Congress. And then the United States Constitution, which is essentially the law of the land. This is the highest supreme law and basically has the last say. There, a little star just to make you feel happy about it because that's pretty cool. And that's the end of the show.